Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Technkon Printers Guide to G7 Implementation webinar. We hope you find today's event very useful. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Bob Burns, and I work in technical sales here at Technkon USA. I will be your moderator and webinar organizer today. With me today is Ron Ellis, who will be our main G7 presenter for today's webinar. Ron is an Ideal Alliance G7 expert, chair of the graphical committee, and has performed well over 100 G7 calibrations. Before we start, let's take a moment to ensure that everybody is ready and familiar with the webinar control panel. First, you should have the control panel on the right side of your screen. You may minimize this panel by clicking the arrow button in the upper left-hand corner. You may expand the panel by clicking on the same button. You'll notice that the screen is split into two parts. On the left side is the video. On the right side is the actual presentation. You can adjust the size of the video or presentation by grabbing the divider line between the two and dragging them left or right, depending on what you want to see larger. Throughout the presentation, we encourage you to interact by typing in questions and all comments using the question pane on your control panel. We will answer all of your questions after the presentation. I'm going to wait a few minutes just to give everybody an opportunity to log on, and then we'll start the actual presentation itself.
So I think we can start with these first few things because they're not really the core presentation.
Absolutely.
So my name is Ron Ellis, and I work in most of the Northeast area as a consultant. And I probably do 1 to 2 G7 calibrations a week, and I've been doing them since 2006. So I've done many, many of them. I'm pretty familiar with it. And then I'm involved with the graphical committee and a bunch of individuals who work to make all this stuff. And I'm a G7 expert like many others are. But I do a lot of this, so the guide, if you had downloaded it, has a lot of the insight of things that I found that make G7 successful. And there's a lot of that in there. And then we'll have a lot of time today to answer questions and anything that you might have. The presenter, you took part of this slide out. They took part of this slide out.
Story of my life.
The story of my life where I used to work. But Bob Burns, who's tech sales here, but he has a lot of imaging background as well. And some of the companies he worked for, Iris Graphics,
which is a Cytex company, Howtech, digital scanner company, and been in the industry a while.
So he's got a lot of color experience. Even though it looks like there's nothing right there after his picture. There's a lot behind it. The agenda, and one of the big ideas of today's presentation was to have a lot of Q&A so that people could ask questions, and we could answer questions. And pretty much any question you have, we can take a shot at and try to answer it. Before we did that, I wanted to go through some G7 basics, really quick, maybe 20 or 30 minutes. Simple things that you may already know, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So the second half will be all Q&A. And part of the big idea was that after people have read this guide, they may have questions, may have seen things in there and need more information on it, or just have questions about the way that we do G7 or the equipment that we show today or talk about. So that's our agenda. We'll go through a little bit of really basic things about G7, and then we'll get into Q&A.
Sounds good. And I would assume that pretty much everybody who is going to attend has logged on. Just to let everybody know, we are recording this, which we can make this recording available should you not have been able to attend it today. And we'll post that.
Yep. And it's a beautiful summer day here. We're in New England. Technkon in the USA is just north of Boston, and that happens to be where I live and Bob lives. And so, nice day. We're glad to be here to do this.
Absolutely. So go ahead and you can start the main course, and we can follow from there and then get into Q&A.
Yeah. So, first thing we're going to talk about a little bit is what G7 is and how it benefits printers. And a lot of the benefit of G7 has to do with having a target and having something to aim at. So when I talk with printers, lot of the benefits that I find G7 has is really something to aim at. And it's something consistent because with G7, it doesn't matter which press, if it's the first press or the second press, or even if it's the wide format machine like a Butech or a Durst or something, or if it's an offset press, you have consistent aims for all those devices. And it means you don't have to learn 20 different calibrations or 20 different ways to do things. It's so simple that when I work with print buyers, they can actually go out and they can go almost anywhere and get an idea if the color is what it should be. And we'll go through that a little bit more. But it benefits printers in that way of giving them something to aim at and something to consistently look at and check and quickly see if it matches. Also, being part of G7, or being a G7 master printer benefits printers because it gives print buyers a list of printers that they know should be able to achieve this. So it's very beneficial, both for the printer and both for people who are buying printing. I'll talk a little bit about the history of G7, and on that previous slide you saw a little photographer's grayscale card. And on the left here, we have Don Hutchinson, who is the inventor of G7. And I'll give just a 2-minute kind of overview of where G7 came from. And that was years ago, back around 2004, Don Hutchinson was chair of Grackle. And they were tasked with coming up with a new version of Grackle. And they were looking at different ways of doing it. And Don, at that point, was a consultant, just like he is right now. And he had done a lot of work with scanners, and he had come up with kind of a method that involved using gray balance, much like the photographer's gray card, to get a scanner to be correct or to get a press to be correct. It's kind of his own method and his own way of doing it. Granted, many people have used gray balance in the past. It's not new to just G7. But anyway, as he went to do this, the first thing he tried to do is use TBI curves. He took the ISO standard and tried to do it. And he did it in a bunch of printing situations, and he found out that they didn't match. It didn't quite work. He wasn't getting the visual match that he needed to. So they tried that, they scrapped that, and then they began and they tested with this push-to-press method that he had developed. And that worked pretty well, and so as the Grackle Committee chair, he moved forward with that with the support of ID Alliance and members of the committees. And they actually tested it, showed that it worked, and developed it as the G7 method. So on the left, you see Don, he was the inventor of it. ID Alliance in the middle is the organization in charge of G7, Grackle, and SWAP. And then on the bottom right, you see the print properties meeting, and that's the ID Alliance committee that is responsible for coming up with profiles and print conditions and data sets. And you can see you have a bunch of people in there, and they're arguing about things like color bars and profiles and things like that. So if you look at that history, there's a lot to do with ID Alliance and with Don Hutchinson working together with the print properties and the ID Alliance committees. That's where G7 came from, and then it was released in 2006. First, it took a year or two to catch on, but as brands began to work with it, it became very popular, to the point today where it pretty much is the default print condition. If somebody puts a proofer in North America, somebody who calibrates a press, they're almost always going to this print condition. And quick overview. I don't know if I can spend a lot of time on that, but don't go for it. If you look at G7, very often people are confused because there's a lot of G's. Like Grackle has a G in it, and G7 has a G in it, and people get somewhat confused about it. But if we look at what G7 is, the name G is for grayscale, 7 represents the 7 primary colors, which you can see there, which are CMYK, RGB. But there's a definition of it, and to go really quickly and simple through it, the two things we care about in G7 are gray balance. You can see our HR patch here, the 50, 40, 40. And we have values for the gray and how that should look. So we're looking for correct gray balance. And we're also looking for tonality up and down the tone scale for the right weight or tonality. Those two things are G7. If we can achieve both of those, then we've achieved G7. One thing that's new about G7 is that when we do G7 on an offset press, we end up with Grackle. If we do it on sheet, on a web press, we end up with SWAP. But G7 was the produced the world's first telemetric print spec, which was Grackle. And that means that, unlike all the other print specs before that, that print spec of Grackle, 2006, was entirely defined as LAD, in color. So it's the first spec that was color, not defined by docking, not defined by density, but the first time that we begin to define and evaluate based on color. And that's really important, because density doesn't transfer well between different printing methods and flexes and those. So the world's first telemetric print spec where we can measure color and judge everything based on that color. We have some other aspects of G7 that are important. And I have a little picture here of one of the color charts from the Ideal Alliance poster. And you can get this type of stuff from the Ideal Alliance website. But if we look at it, I talked about G7 only being gray balance and tonality, and that's what G7 is. If we then add in the LAD values for the solids and the overprints, that is called G7 targeted, and that's how we do Grackle. And if you look at that guide from Technkon that they sponsored, you can see in there that the first thing we're always doing is lining up the solids, lining up the overprints, and getting those colors right. That represents the gamut of our printing method. If we get that correct, then we on top of that, do G7 to get tonality and gray balance. And that's how we get Grackle. Doing that to an offset press, just doing that method with G7 tonality, gray balance, and the targeted ink gamut that we work with, we can get a delta E that's usually under 3 delta E away from Grackle. Really good. It works very well. The next is G7 color space, and that's where we actually do the entire color space, all the patches. That would be like an IP8. So that's not just solids, not just overprints and gray balance. That's the entire gamut, everything up and down it. And that's G7 color space. That would be a proofer or digital printer. And then other things about G7 is that it is a CGAT standard, so it's actually a national standard in the U.S. and internationally recognized. So CGAT's TR15, which was developed by Ideal Alliance and MPES CGAT, and that's a standard that can be downloaded, and it actually describes all the math behind G7. And the math behind G7 in that document is complicated, but to actually implement G7 is not very hard. If we look at other parts of G7, there are 7 new data sets that were released, new Grackle, new swap profiles, and these are all released as a national standard in the U.S. and in finals as an ISO standard. So, other parts of G7. Of course, with G7, there are a couple of profiles that are pretty famous. And I know that very often people don't think of profiles as being famous. But in the world of printing, I think of them as being famous. But anyway, they're very famous and well-known. And these are the ones that you would find in Photoshop, the first couple. And if you buy a device like the Spectrodyne, all these profiles are loaded in, even the new ones, the 7 new ones. But these most famous profiles are Grackle. And Grackle is the sheet-fed offset profile. Swap, which is for web or publication printing. And these are pretty popular. You can go almost anywhere. And most digital printers are aimed at Grackle. Almost every proofing system that you buy today has these profiles built into them. And Grackle is probably the most popular profile. So most designers, if they don't know what they're aiming at, this is the profile that people aim at. This is the one that when you buy a digital printer, it's aimed at this. When you do work for a printer, most printers are targeting this. So these are the most famous profiles. And they're managed by Ideal Alliance. So if I do G7 to a sheet-fed press, I end up with Grackle. If I do G7 to a web press, I end up with Swap. But these are the ones. They're in Photoshop, and by picking one of these, we can have a working space and a target that we know a printer can hit. There's a lot of benefits for printers using G7. You can see on the left there I have a bunch of press sheets and a proof. And the biggest benefit that printers get is a really quick proof-to-press match. Also, you get good make-ready. So if I think of where I was a few weeks ago, I was on vacation last week. But if I think of where I was a few weeks ago, I was at a printer, and a lot of times they'll have me in for a couple different reasons to do G7. One is that they were having trouble matching proof-to-press. And very common, people have this issue, come in, do G7, at the end of the day, they actually have approved the test match. So they look at it, and I do approve the G7 using the graphical profile, not the press. And then I do the press to G7, we put them together. And they're usually a pretty good match most of the time. That's a benefit. The second one is that when you're printing to a recognized standard, like graphical or using something like G7, it becomes attractive to print buyers. So people, by printing, very often will go out and look for G7 masters. And it's one of the ways that they qualify the printer. So it's the way that they can know that a printer is good and the printer is somebody that should be able to do the quality of work that they need. So the G7 program, and this is the part that ID Alliance manages, there are G7 master printers. And these are printers that have gone through and printed a sheet and calibrated, mailed that sheet into to ID Alliance, and RIP reads the sheet and qualifies them. So those are G7 master printers, and they're printers that have proved they can do it. There's about 1,300 in the world right now, probably about 1,000 in the U.S., and then in Asia and other parts of the world there's quite a few more. So it's international. There are G7 experts, and those are people like myself and many other consultants who've gone through and been trained on it. And these people can come in and do this with you and then send that sheet into ID Alliance. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. There's ID Alliance, who is the owner and manager of G7. And then Don Hutchison, the inventor, and he's the master trainer who trains G7 experts. And still very involved in it, in the direction that it goes. So, pretty big program, and it's international in terms of their affiliates all over the world. So if you're a print buyer or a printer, it's not just a U.S. thing. It happens in China, it happens in Korea, it happens all over Asia. We have ID Alliance has an Indian affiliate as well. So this is an international printing spec that can be done all over the world, not just the U.S. thing.
It is amazing how fun having worked with Technkon for 7 years and seeing when it first really started, and 7 years later, I can't visit a printer that has not either invented certification or they're considering it or using it, what have you. It is amazing how big it is going.
It is big, and probably for every printer who's gone through and become a G7 master printer, there's probably 10 who are aiming at the same thing and doing the same process, but just deciding not to mail in the sheet. So it's pretty big. I guess the other part that's interesting is that, when you send over all the stuff that's in here on G7 to the German guys who make this stuff, they understand it.
Yeah.
They know it. Right? They know what it is. So it's pretty interesting that way as well. So we'll talk a little bit too about how you implement and maintain G7. And on the right there is a picture of a bunch of people I'm training to learn G7. You can see they've all got press sheets. I think I've got 3 or 4 groups of people, and they're all measuring the matches and everything. And on the left is a curve screenshot. Of course, there's other programs that do this too, but that's what I have used in our guide. And it shows things like you can see here that they've got gray balance, they've got tonality, and there's numbers and things that show that as well. But implementing G7 is important. And it's actually fairly easy. In the beginning, you can have a G7 expert come in and help you with it. And that's someone such as myself or over 400 individuals who've gone through that training. And or you could get trained to become a G7 expert or a professional yourself. Then use software and tools such as Curve 3, or there's an updated list that will be in the guide that helps other manufacturers who make that software. And then you need some way to measure with a device such as the Spectre does. So it's pretty easy, and it's fairly simple. I think one of the reasons that G7 has been successful is that it's easy to understand. In the beginning, people think that's a lot, but if you compare this to other methods of calibration, very simple, very easy. So actually, if I go back to that last one, if you have not read that guide that is on the Technkon website, then you should read that, because that kind of gives a step-by-step picture of how you do a G7 calibration and a lot of information about, in general, what it is. For a second here, we'll talk a little bit about Technkon and the built-in functions that Technkon instruments have that relate to G7. So if you can share the screen, I'll pop up I want to read a couple things just to show it.
Absolutely.
Okay, so a couple of quickie things here. On a SpectroDen, some of the things that I find really interesting that talk about the G7 features are, it has something called a gray guide. And with this gray guide, I can read a gray patch. And you'll see that when I read that patch, it's pretty neat because it is showing me, no, here's show this. It's showing me a couple of things. First, it's giving me my HR. So it's saying I am 5 points too heavy, my HR is, and that's my weight or my tonality. And then it's going in there and it's basically showing me that I'm plus 2.2 on the A and plus 3 on the B. And then it gives me a correction factor. So it shows I'm aiming at Crackle, here's my LAB. Then it's saying to get to gray balance, I want a minus 4 points of cyan, 5 points of magenta, 9 points of yellow. See this yellow number? So it's making the correction. Pretty neat feature, really helpful. Can you read the solid for me, Bob? Sure. Okay, take a look at that. If I hit a solid, I get my density, I get my delta E, and it's giving me pass-fail. And then I also get my LAB numbers. So that's all on one screen. I see all that stuff at once. Very, very helpful. Can you read an overprint? Sure. Can you get me that? Yep, same thing. Overprint's giving me a delta E and LAB numbers. And then if you can switch to ISO check and just read a solid. Okay. ISO check. Yeah. So these are metrics that you check in G7, and I talk in the guide about how to check them and what they mean and why they matter. But they're all quick and easy, and of course you can do this with any instrument that you can see here that on one screen you're seeing all this. Okay, and with ISO check, if you read the solid, that's telling me I have a delta E of 3, but I should be able to get my delta E down by 2 by going up 11 points in my cyan density. So it's predictive technology. When you're first doing targeting in G7, really helpful. So I think that's all I was going to kind of show when we look at it. So these are features that relate to G7 that are really unique. That dynamic G7 with the paper color does the equation and figures out what the grade should be. And then it tells you where to go to match that grade. And then the ISO check and the solids and the overprints are pretty neat features. And one of the things about G7, and probably the biggest thing, is that getting there is really quick. And I talked about how usually in a day I can calibrate a press and you can pull that in really quickly. But that calibration, it's good that day. But as you guys know, presses are mechanical. They're complicated. They change a lot. So that calibration really represents that moment in time. And that press probably will never be exactly like that again. That press changes. And it's going to drift. And that's a lot of the part of G7. Calibrating and learning to do that is really easy. The part that people often forget is that they don't check it and track it and pull it back as it drifts. And that's part of the reason to learn to do G7 yourself, is so that you can make those corrections. Because typically, over a year, most presses will still be sort of close. But it really depends on how you do maintenance and how you maintain your equipment. So I may go back and find somebody who hasn't moved at all. And I have a couple customers within a couple hours a year who 2 years later can use the same curve. But I have other people who don't do such good maintenance, and they need to do it every 6 months or adjust it more.
And a customer with a press that sank 2 inches.
Well, that would
So their variances went way out, but it stood to reason to be able to check those and figure out when you're getting drifting substantial drift.
Yeah, that's right. And that's where we saw those things that I was just reading, like the delta E of the solid, the delta E of the overprint, the gray balance. Just quickly reading those tells you if you're where you should be normally. Those are important. So doing the G7 calibration is really quick. Maintaining it is as important as doing the calibration. It's no good to get there for one day. You don't want somebody just running through in one day and just like getting you there and boom, they run out the door and you don't know what they did. You need to understand it and at least understand how to tell if it whether you're going to pull it back in or have them come back and do it, that doesn't matter, but you need to be able to check. So it's important. So I have the quote by Peter Drucker there, what gets measured gets managed. If you're not checking it, there's no way you can keep it there or fix it. And a lot of times what happens with the press is that somebody will begin to calibrate. They'll calibrate it, they'll get it there, they get great make-readies, and then maybe a month later, they lose 10 minutes, the press has to do a little more. Usually at the point that it gets so bad that they can't get there, they call me because the customer's threatening to leave or something. But this change from a 20-minute make-ready or 15-minute make-ready down to a 45-minute make-ready is real money in a training plan. That make-ready is important. And pressmen are going to do their best, so they don't usually complain. They're just going to keep messing around to get as close as they can. So you need to be on top of it and measuring so you can correct that back before it gets that far away.
You can imagine the amount of ink and paper on 30-minute difference is going to be huge, really huge.
Yeah. And if you understand this, you can pull things back really quickly, and the goal is to always keep it efficient like that. So the most common pitfalls that we have the first one that the expert comes in and does the G7 calibration, but they don't teach you. They don't teach you how to watch it, how to maintain it, and how to understand what they did. So your G7, you have the logo, but you really don't know. You can't really tell if the shoe is good or bad. Second one is only to be checking once a year, and then you come in for the G7 calibration. You should be checking yourself. Third common pitfall is bad measurement, and that's when you're measuring something and you're either measuring a bad sheet, or a sheet that's not representative, or you actually have a bad measurement and you're not calibrated or something, and it throws you off and down a road where you never get there. Fourth one is not understanding how to measure G7 yourself. So you need to understand it yourself. Even if you don't do the calibration and you hire someone once a year or whenever it goes, you need to be able to measure and tell where you are so that you can troubleshoot on your press. And yesterday I was analyzing some press sheets, and I went through them all, and just reading a little control script into the software we're using, we can see the job wasn't gray balanced. You can see the cyan gain was 22% instead of 17%. These are things that a press operator sees that they can go back and fix it and make it be where it should be. So it's important because having this knowledge is how you get power.
Yeah, I've been out in the field a lot and I've noticed that some people who have been G7 certified, but they don't know how to do it.
Right.
And what's interesting is I've seen you on site, and that's one of the things that I really liked was the fact that it wasn't a matter of just doing the calibration. You actually spent the time to say, this is what you need to do. Get the check. This is what you need to do. And I think that's an important point is learning. They need to learn it themselves. Otherwise, they're always going to have somebody come in to do it for them.
Right. And I think the bigger part is if you don't know what to look for and don't know what to check, then that quick make-ready and the profitable printing operation goes away. Not to mention customers complaining and not being able to match the food. So it's really, really important to get that out of it, to get those key understandings of, how do I tell if it's okay? If it's not okay, what do I do?
And then if they get too far down the road where they can't find their way back, that's when you do want to bring somebody like yourself to say, okay, something's wrong here, something's not working right. That's when you want to have somebody who can come in and help with that.
My number one goal with my best customers is I train them to do it themselves. So I have many customers who they own all the tools, all the software. They drift. They pull it right back in. When I do my yearly with them, they actually, they send me the sheets like, do you see them? They're living G7 100%. And then not everybody has those resources, so if they don't, at the very least, you have to be able to measure and check and use it and understand it. So, Bob, you can talk about your products and what you have.
I'm just going to briefly talk about our Technkon family of products. We have the automated Spectra 5. It's a scanning spectrodensitometer that measures a 40-inch color bar in under 8 seconds. And it displays all the relevant density, color, and G7 information all in one display for all the different ink zones. We have the SpectroJet, which is, again, it's a manual hand scanning spectrodensitometer that can scans the same speed, but it's a manually drawn across the color bar to take the measurements and will display the same results as the spectral guide. I call it our flagship product only because we just sold what I call a bazillion of spectrogens. That's our handheld instrument, which it's very fast in spot check mode. It measures patches at 1 second per measurement and displays the results on a high-resolution color screen. But in addition to that, it has the ability to actually scan color control bars up to 54 patches. So that way you're not just doing spot checks, you're scanning all in one fell swoop. So things like the ID Alliance color control strip and others, very quickly, in a matter of seconds, you can actually gather all that information. The spectral plate, which is a high-resolution digital microscope that is used to qualify the plates that you're creating to put on press are within specification, so you know that if your 50% value is truly 50% value and you don't have an acceptable dot gain, it has the ability to do a bunch of other stuff as far as AM, FM, hybrid screens, a number of other different functions. And then the spectral etch, that's our inline spectral densitometer that was actually developed over here using the Technkon technology, and that basically gets installed right directly on a flexo, a digital or digital press, and takes measurements at actual production speeds. We also have a pre-setting and closed-loop solution called PressLink, which is an automated color control system for the press that, based on the file coming down from pre-press, will automatically adjust to the optimal for optimal ink coverage just starting out on a job. And then during production, we use things like the spectral guide scanner that will scan the color bar and then make corrections automatically to the ink keys to bring you back to your ink color state. And one other product I mentioned is our Chroma QA, which is a quality control software for basically verifying, measuring and verifying your print conditions and whether you're in or out of tolerance, what you need to do to get in tolerance, and to generate press run performance reports. So we have a lot of different products, but I won't go on and on as much as I can. But feel free to contact us on those, because that in a nutshell are Technkon products.
So for more information on G7, we have a few different websites here. The ID Alliance website, of course, idalliance.org, and that's the main official website for G7. And below that, we have Technkon USA, and they have many articles and white papers on measurement and G7 as well. And then my own website, ronellis.us, which is a website that the same thing has many articles. So there's contact information here that you can look at if you need any further information. So I think you may have something more for questions.
Well, no, actually, I think now is a good time to start our Q&A. So please feel free to go ahead and ask some questions, and we'll do our best to answer them.
So right now we're not navigating. Somebody is navigating to pick up the question.
Good. So we have a question, can you demonstrate calibration?
I could demonstrate calibration, although my computer's not plugged in. There's stuff on there I could use.
Yes.
But I could kind of do a virtual one here in a minute if we can figure out a way to do that.
Yeah, I mean, actually, we could.
And we can answer another question while we're waiting for that.
Yeah, why don't we do that? I think that would through.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have one here, which is which one would be used for corrugated?
Can you scroll up? Is that the entire question?
Yep.
Yeah. So, which profile would be used for corrugated? I assume is the question. And the way that it works is we have all of these profiles have a white point, which is the color of the paper on them. And by looking at the white point, we pick the closest profile. So we have the grapple and swap profiles, which have pretty white papers. And then we have we have these 7 new profiles, which just were released. If you pick the closest profile, if the paper is not close enough or the color of the paper is not close enough, we do something called substrate correction, where we actually modify that data set, which is the collection of colors that make the profile, and then generate a new profile data set. So for corrugated, I think the big question would be what is the color or white point of that paper?
Another question, Ron, is what is the acceptable delta E and density for overprints?
Okay, so that's a pretty good question there. And before I move on to that, so for that corrugated question, the biggest question or the biggest thing there is what is the white point of corrugated? And based on the white point, we pick the closest profile. If that profile is not within maybe 3 delta E, then we're going to do something called substrate correction. And we're going to have it modify that profile for that color space for that. Keep in mind that G7, that gray balance, always moves with the color of the substrate. So that target gray is going to change with the color of the substrate.
Can you explain, you mentioned substrate correction. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. Substrate correction is where we take a data set, and a data set essentially is a profile or a color space. And we put in a new white point, and as we put in that new white point, it's then going to give us a new set of numbers. And that new set of numbers we can make a profile from, and it becomes our aim point for the solids and the overprints and the gray balance.
So basically, if the substrate's not covered within the standards, then it's compensates for that.
Right. So if we look at Grackle 2006 and Swap 2006, the older ones, they have white points. The new profiles that have just been released, which most people aren't familiar with yet. Within that document, which is CGAS 21, there are directions on how to do the substrate correction. And we have tools on the Grackle website, so if you were to go to grackle.org, you can look it up and get more information on it. There's actual spreadsheets there you can use too.
It's actually something we recently, on the SpectroDens implemented for ISO check and G7, implemented the FCCA.
That's right, actually. So the SpectroDens has an option in here where you can look at the color of the paper and remove all those solid and overprints to match that on the fly. Yeah. So another question is calibrating to Grackle 2013 the same as Grackle 2006? And the answer is no. And there's a lot of information coming out on this that will come out by Graph Expo and Print. And if you go to the Grackle website, there's documents that begin to talk about this, so you can see what the difference is. But keeping it quick, Grackle 2006 was all done with old instrumentation. And pretty much any instrument you buy now that's new, I shouldn't say any, but when you buy a new instrument, you want to make sure that it has M1, as does this one right here. And M1 is a new measurement mode that's made for measuring OBAs. It's got UV energy in it. Grackle 2013 was all based on M1. So Grackle 2006 is the older type of instrument. Grackle 2013 is based on being able to measure OBAs, and there's this new instrument here. This can measure both M0 and M1, and there's other M standards too. But that's the key thing with Grackle 2013 is that it's based on using M1 measurement. And it's a longer topic than we can cover here, but it's probably a future topic. And if you look at that, except for using the M1 instrument, and there's some stuff about correlating the proof paper to the press sheet, because we now can use Brighton papers with Grackle 2013. except for that, the calibration method itself is the same. Can the spectrodems read a P2P and an IT8 target? The spectrodems can read a P2P, although I usually don't use it for it, but it can because it can read strips and it can read large batches. Theoretically, you could read an IT8, but I think
that would be a lot of patches to measure with a hand tool.
Right. But I mean, you can do, even though you can do strip mode, so you can, this has wheels on it, or you can pull it across. On a P2P, it probably could pick that up.
Yes.
But an IT8, I think that would be a bit much. It's not as much as a Okay, and then next question is, can we use G7 to print on two different paper colors that look very similar? And what G7 compliance should we use? So that's a pretty good question, and a lot of that has to do with how different is the white point. So I could have two different papers, and if the white point is not too far away, they're going to look similar. If so if I have paper number 1 and it's maybe minus 3 B star, I have paper number 2 and it's maybe 4 B star, I can print and I can calibrate and they're going to look perfect. The only problem that occurs is if I had, say, a really super bright paper like a minus 7 or minus 8 B star, and then I had a paper that's minus 2 B star, like a normal, very neutral paper, just the papers alone are going to make it hard for me to make them look the same. So even though G7 is going to get the gray right on both of those, that gray is relative to the paper color. And just the paper color itself is going to color all the highlights in and make those two a little bit far apart. So some of this has to do with correlating between the paper difference. And as a quick rule of thumb, if your paper is within 3 delta E, you probably can get away with it. If it's more than that, then it's going to be tricky. And you can see that, again, I'll refer to that CGAS 21 document, which is probably more than people want to know, but if you go in there, it talks about being within 5 delta E and correlating paper difference. If the white point is too far apart, it's hard to get a match. Can you mount a spectral edge on an inline press?
Yeah, basically that we call it the inline product, the spectral edge, which by the way uses the same technology as the spectral edge and our other instruments, so our inter-instrument agreement is extremely good. It is mounted inline on the press for flexo, for reviewer, and for digital presses.
There was another question in there that I think I missed that said, what are the tolerances for the delta E's for solids and overprints? And that's in the guide, but it's 5 for solids for Graco 2006 and 6 for overprints. And for Graco 2013, there are different numbers because it's using a different delta E formula, but essentially the same. So it's 2.5 and 3. But if you're looking for that information, that's stuff you can download. Okay, another one. Another question is, do you recommend linearizing plates before printing G7 test charts? This is a very controversial subject, which people have gone back and forth on. And Don, the inventor of G7, recommends not linearizing, just to go raw. But I myself usually linearize, and that's because if the plate moves, I need them to be able to pull it back. So controversial, you can do it one way or the other. There's no right or wrong answer for that. Personally, I usually linearize the plate so that if the plate changes or if there's some type of issue, they can just redo their length curve and pop it back in. Either way, whether you linearize or don't linearize, you want to record the values you're reading on the plate, and then you can QC those. And so every time you make a plate, some people do every plate, some people do once a day, but you're going to read the values on that plate. So that plate is staying the same. Then the question, you use Curve 3 or the Idealine spreadsheets to do your curve calculation? The Idealine spreadsheets don't actually do curve calculations. They're there for quality control purposes and to teach you. So personally, I use Curve 3 quite a bit. I use other products also. So sometimes I end up using All-On and Curve 3 or different products that are out there. There's a list that is add into the newest version of the calibration guide the Technkon website has. But it depends on what you're doing, and it may be built into software that you have. But a lot of times I use Curve 3 because that's what my customers use, and it's very simple. Is there any possible way to install closed-loop measuring systems on a MANRO of 700 or 720? And I would say yes.
Yes, there is. Actually, that's not a problem at all. We can do it on the 700 series presses.
Most presses can be retrofitted. So.
Most presses can definitely be retrofitted.
Yeah. One more regarding profiles. Is the profiling dependent upon press condition? As the blanket light changes, the profile needs to change, or is this needed to be calibrated after every production run? So this is an interesting question because I talked earlier, and I don't know if anybody caught this, but I said when I usually do sheet fed, usually the first thing that I do is I calibrate the proofer, I calibrate the grapple. I don't actually calibrate to that press. So I calibrate it, and then I go calibrate the presses that we're doing. And before we do the press, we want to make sure we have a blanket that's not too old or not too new, so usually a day old maybe. They strike the rollers, they check the chemistry, we check everything to make sure the press is normal. Not having a normal press throws your calibration out. But aim the press at Grackle using G7, aim the proofer at Grackle. That proofer should never change. It's always going to be the same. As the press drifts, we then recalibrate the press to pull that back in. But that calibration to the press should be done with the press having good condition, rollers striped, everything checked, chemistry correct, blankets that are not completely beat up but not completely new either. Next question is from somebody who has many customers using old presses and is reading about the SpectroJet and using that press, but not sure if you can read a full color bar with a Spectro lens, or if you need to have the SpectroJet. That's your...
Yeah, and the SpectroJet and SpectroDrive are made very specifically for measuring long color bars. The scanning function on the SpectroDens, and so for the drive and the jet, you're looking for on-press control, so to speak, of, okay, what are my densities, G7 color and what have you. For the SpectroDens and measuring, it's more for, like, if you wanted to validate or verify proofs. You could scan short color control bars like the ideal lines or Fogler, what have you. But the SpectroDens is not made for doing, say, a 40-inch press sheet to measure in each inch what density and other values there are. So that would be the answer. The SpectroDens is a handheld. It's good for short-run scans, but for on-press tools of complete color control bars, you would want to use the SpectroJet and or SpectroDrive.
Next one is asking, is G7 appropriate for flexo printing? And it is, actually. It's used quite a bit for flexo. Usually it's matching the Grackle profile, but there's also a flexo profile as one of the new profiles that was released. So it's used a lot for flexo, and it's very successful.
Yeah, it's growing, too. From what the flexo printers I'm talking to, the adoption rate seems to be much more than, say, 3 years ago when I don't think many flexo printers were using G7.
There were still quite a few then. Yeah, but G7 has been one of the gentlemen who's part of Ideal Line, Steve Smiley, does lots of flexo and very successful with it. And many brands out there are printing flexo with G7. So it's done quite a bit. And if you look at the first guide, so there's an FDA first guide, and that actually talks about G7 and flexo in it. To get expert certified, you take the Ideal Lines G7 expert class, and that's offered at Ideal Lines. You can check out their website. They'll have a list of the next class, which I think is in a few weeks, but they're offered in different spots in the U.S. Every month or so. So quite a few classes. How well does this work with Flexo Spot, and do you have to fingerprint each machine? If the machines print the same, you would not have to fingerprint each machine, but that depends on if the machines print the same. But it works very well with Flexo. With spot colors, I'm not sure if that spot means spot colors or just Flexo, the way that you make the plates. But works very well with Flexo, and of course the newer Flexo presses hold teeny tiny dots and print very well. But it's used, again, it's used very much in Flexo. Flexo is very popular. And Clemson, Steve Smiley, the FDA, those guys are all big into G7 with Flexo. Dennis says, I've noticed that many printers have the certificate on the wall but don't recertify. Why do you think this is? Now that is a good question, because if I look at my customers, I probably have about a 90% recertification rate. Occasionally I have somebody who drops it off. And I don't know the official Idealines numbers, you have to ask them, but recertifying is about $550 or maybe a few dollars more than that. It's not a lot of money. And I have some who don't recertify because they go out of business occasionally, but most of my customers do. But I think the big reason would be if your customers demand it, you're going to recertify it. If you're praying for the type of people who need it, you're going to recertify. And if not, you're going to decide, I can use this to calibrate. And as I mentioned, probably for every customer that I qualify and send it in, 10 of them are doing this without sending it in, just to keep their plant going. Is G7 obtainable if the customer is printing in a reverse sequence? That's a great question. So, ideally, if we were doing G7 itself, all we need is CMY. So G7 itself, we can have 3 colors. Usually we have 4. But all we need is CMY, and we can be there. It doesn't matter the sequence. I have people printing on plastic where they have to move it, and people printing on other printing processes where they can't go KCMY. So that's obtainable. That's called G7 gray. That's grayscale only. There's G7 targeted, and I talked about G7 targeted where I have to get the overprints from the solids. If I'm doing G7 targeted, then I actually do need to be in the right sequence to get the overprints, unless the ink company can somehow make the inks work that way. So basic G7 where I have only gray balance. I don't have the overprints. I'm not going to get a perfect color match up in the solids. For basic G7, it does not matter. The sequence doesn't matter. If I'm trying to match a color space like Grackle for G7 targeted, then the sequence actually does matter. And then next question, are Grackle 2015 and Grackle Plus the same? And they are not. So Grackle 2013 is the new profile, just being released, or just has been released as part of CGET's 21.7 profiles that were made using G7 that are part of the standard. Grackle Plus is kind of a code name for a new initiative that Don's working on with Idealines, which is a high gamut G7. And there'll be more information on that at the G7 Summit coming up in September at Craft Expo. And then, is there a worksheet to fill out to start implementation? And there actually is on the Idealines website. There's a qualification kit. And it's right on the Grackle page. If you go to grackle.org, you can see there's a qualification kit. That has some checklists in there that you can fill out and a bunch of information on how to get ready for it. Is there a Mac software for the Spectre thing? Sadly, there is.
We get that question more and more frequently, but unfortunately, currently, we don't support the Mac OS. Windows-based applications only.
So people like myself are out there using it all day long. I have parallels. I use parallels.
Yeah.
And so I can flip back and forth. But there isn't. Depending on what you're doing with it, the software may support it. So if you're using a product that actually runs on the Mac side, they may have a way to measure it. But the software that comes with it doesn't. Our curves are already implemented. Will this help? Is the question. And curves are pretty easy to change. So a lot of times if I run in somewhere where there is a curve, I can, in different software, you can basically curve on a curve. Like in Curve, I can pre-enter the curves and curve on top of that. And very often if I'm doing an FM screening with G7 or something like that, I actually pre-curve as well and build on it because I know I'm going to get in a lot more. Next question we have is, our profile in Illustrator is set for coded Grackle 2006. Would we have to establish a new profile for uncoded stock? And the answer to that, You have Grackle 2006, which is coded. In the 7 new profiles that were just released, there is a Grackle uncoded. So that's profile number 3 in the list, and you can get that from the grackle.org website. But there's an uncoded profile in there. It should be a different profile because the gamut of coded is so much greater, and the visual look is so much different that if you're designing for it, that should be your final profile. And very often people would design for Grackle because that's the largest gamut profile that we have, and then they would then convert at the last minute down into something smaller. And that lets you go commercial, and then if you need to take that same job and go to uncoded, you can then convert at the last minute. That's probably a little plastic. Are you aware of what tolerance and method for curve software is? The curve software right now is Delta E76, and which is plain Delta E. And for G7, we actually have 2 different metrics. One called Delta CH, which is how we measure breakouts, and the other is Delta L, which is how we measure tonality. But old Grackle is Delta E76. New versions of Grackle, all the new profiles are Delta E2000. That's kind of important to know as you calibrate. Should an audit of the current presses print condition be conducted before a G7 implementation? And that's a really good question because my best customers do this. So my best customers will actually run a test, and they'll actually do a registration test with the press, and they'll check everything on that press, and they'll basically audit that press, whether they do it themselves or they may send it out or call somebody in. They will do that before they actually do this. If you can do that, it helps a lot. Then I have many customers who won't go that far, but what they do is they bring in the ink guy, they bring in the guy who sells them blankets and fountain solutions, they have them go through all the rollers, their own guys, so they actually go through the press that way using the vendors they're working with. Not quite as objective, but it's, they make sure that press is in good condition. In the qualification kit I talked about, which is on grackle.org, there is a press, internal press audit that you can do yourself. And that's where you can actually go there and you can basically write down all the roller stripes, all the things that you use, the pH of the fountain solution, everything. But if you can do an audit, that's great. If you can't do an outside independent audit, if you can get your vendors involved and checking everything out with you, very often they'll do that at no cost and they're glad to be part of it. And if nothing else, you can fill out the forms that we have that get you writing it down. And the reason that you want to record this and check this, not to give to me or the G7 expert or ID Alliance, it's so that when things don't work later, you can figure out what happened and what changed. And before you invest the money in calibration, to make sure that everything's good. Next question, do you find folks adding toner or extender to Plexo inks to get correct densities? And that is, yes, people do that to get the Plexo inks to be in the right spot. They're going to add an extender or tone to it. So that's part of the first training teaches that, and some of the G7 training teaches that. The second question is, can you read Plexo plates?
The answer would be no. We cannot read Plexo plates. Spectral plate product is geared specifically towards conventional aluminum, polyester, offset plates.
Yeah. And then we have somebody else who is asking, if we could just get the programs to stop rewriting software every 3 months, maybe we can get some stability. It is funny because every time I turn on somebody's Mac at a customer, it's auto update, Adobe Creative Cloud. Okay, and then the display on my SpectroBend Premium looks different than what you're showing. Is it just a software upgrade, or do I need a whole new unit?
Well, if you have Google released a new updated version of the SpectroBend high-resolution color display, some additional features to what it currently has. So if you have a black and white display, you would have to upgrade to a whole new unit. You should contact us, and we would do our best to make that happen for you. With the least amount of things.
Yep. Okay. Next next one. What about mill paper, like substrates as PE, DOPP, or similar printed in flexo here? I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean, things like poly. So G7 is, I think, so G7 is done on plastic and flexo, and if you go to my website, there's a blog, and you can see examples of the printing on gravure and flexo and all sorts of non-paper materials. The only thing you have to watch is measurement. So on some of the polys and stuff, you can measure pretty well. Metallic, use type of instruments don't measure metallic. True metallic, they'll measure metallic inks, but not an actual metal or plastic substrate. But if you're printing typical flexo for poly type printing, it can be measured fine and no problems with that. What brand of color bars is most recommended? And one of the great things is you can make your own color bars, no issue. And the SpectroDens can read lots of color bars. And then I've used things like SpectroJet to read, Manroland color bars and KPA color bars and all types of color bars. So
our software is geared so you can basically define the color bar you're measuring. So it will be virtually almost any color bar that you want to use.
Next question is, what's the difference between a G7 expert and a professional? And basically, same education, same training, different score on the test. So the G7 expert score is higher. The G7 expert can submit sheets for qualification. G7 professional can only resubmit, they can't do submission. Next one, when I use the gray guide to read my 25, 50, 75 CNY patches, it sees the 25 as CNY, but the 50 and 75 show up as K, not CNY. Is there a setting I need to change? So that's one thing that I would say on an offset press, it should work perfectly. But if I happen to be on a digital press or something using GCR where it's kicking black and stuff into there and doing color management, then the SpectroDen is reading the HR patches and going to give you the accurate data.
I've run across that as well.
Yeah. So that kind of depends on your print type. And if it's not pure CMY, then it may have trouble with it. Okay, next one. When you get substrate-corrected aims, how is the profile modified? You just put curve correction in the rib. So he's talking about if you plug in a new paper color, have the SpectroDen read the paper color, and it'll do the substrate-corrected aims for you automatically. In the spreadsheet, which you can download from ID Alliance, there's directions on how to take that data and put it into I1 Profiler or some other program and make a profile out of it. So you're converting the raw data from CGAS21, such as Graphel or Graphel encoded, and then you're actually going to generate a profile out of that. And then what delta E formula do you prefer, 76, 3000, or CMC? And the way I look at it is if it's anything that's Graphel 2006 or older, 76 would be the delta E profile to use. If it's these new data sets, which are just beginning to get exposure, everything should be delta E 2000. So the new ISO standard, delta E 2000 for ISO 12647-2. All the new profiles we have are same thing, are also delta E 2000. So old stuff, delta E 76, new stuff, delta E 2000. And then does G7 only apply to process colors? It only applies to process colors. However, ID Alliance has a working group that's working on spot colors and how to calibrate them. One of the problems is that spot colors don't calibrate. Dot gain on different spot colors is different. There is no easy way to do it. There's a bunch of math on it that they're working on. So looking for that in the future, but right now that's not part of it. What are the minimal requirements on press to use press link software? I'm not sure.
Press links are close.
Okay, good. Close.
What are the minimal software requirements? Which question? What was that question?
Minimal requirements on press
link software. Basically, what we're supplying is the software and the computer, for that matter, to run all the required converter, control software, presetting, and it's a Windows-based machine. So we do all the software configuration and implementation.
Next question, will you recommend multiple calibration for various substrates such as paper, plastic, fabric? Yes, normally. So it depends on if you're doing color management or not. So if it's just straight normal printing, then I would recommend multiple calibrations, the gray calibration for each of those. Now you can do something with G7 where you make it be a linearization for your device. So if you're talking something like a Roland or a Vutec or one of those devices, you could actually do the gray on one substrate and then color manage on top of the gray on all the others. And that would always pull it back in. But yes, G7 gets used on various substrates very often. And if you think about that question, how many substrates can you do, like in a typical offset press? They usually will do a coated and an uncoated. And then usually the silk or the other colors, they can use something like the spectrodams' gray feature to kind of move the densities up and down and get the G7 without having to have separate curves for every single substrate you have. And then the last question I see here is, you said that Graphical 2013, you need to use M1. What would happen if M0 is used? And that's a great question. Now, we're recommending, or ID Alliance recommends, that you only use M1 for the new data sets and M0 for the old data sets. However, there is a calculation method where you can basically calculate what the M0 data would be based on an M1 data set instead of information. So it's a little bit involved, but technically there is a way to actually kind of simulate M1 with M0. It doesn't look quite as good as doing the M1 calibration, but it looks better than just doing a straight M0 calibration.
Are there any tools for help with that calculation that you're aware of?
Yeah, so that, if you refer to CGET 21, there's information on that. And if you were to follow the ID Alliance print properties working groups, if any of you guys are members of ID Alliance and not involved in these working groups, you should go to the ID Alliance website and look for information there. And you can join these working groups and actually learn about these kind of obscure things. Usually the obscure...
So generally speaking, you're saying use M1 for the 2013,
yeah.
2006, M0.
Old profiles use M0, new ones are all M1. And unless you're really good with spreadsheets, you probably don't want to jump into that other world where you're doing
I would. We do, by the way, have the new 2013 dates on our instrument. So
yep, they're all preloaded, and they can do the substrate correction as well. So those are most of the questions that we have. What I mean by linearization is a question that is, what do I mean by linearization? On a plate, that means putting the plate always in the same position, so that a 50 is a 50, 100 is a 100 all the way up and down it. For a proofer or something, you could actually use G7 to do the linearization, but it means returning something to the same position over and over.
Good. Any other questions? I think we've gone through quite a few. That is a lot.
Good questions.
Very good questions. We will be posting this recording of this webinar. So, if you weren't able to attend, or you'd like to actually review, we will post that. Meanwhile, I want to thank Ron for coming in here for this webinar. It's been very informative, very helpful. And we would welcome any questions that you have now or in the future. So please feel free to visit us on our website, Ron's website, or give us a call.
Do you have on your website a forum where they can ask questions related to this?
We actually have we do have a chat function that is monitored all the time. So if you come up with a question, we're always monitoring it. And, so if they have a question, they can actually get on that chat forum and boom.
24 hours a day.
Heck no. As much as people like that. But thank you again for attending, and we look forward to speaking with you in the future.